Yesterday was Star Wars Day, May the 4th. So today we are continuing our Star Wars content ahead of our Monday Star Wars live stream, talking about Star Wars films. Now we are going to rank every theatrically released Star Wars film on a tier list. There are 12 of those films, the 9 Skywalker Saga films, the 2 anthology films, and then the Clone Wars movie that was released in 2008. We're going to do it in canonical order. And so let's start from the beginning. Let me know what you guys think of my rankings in the comments below. I know some of them might be contentious. My age definitely aids the prequels and diminishes the sequels. So feel free to let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. Try to keep it civil, but honestly, the more comments below, the better for my channel it does. So I really don't care that much what you guys say about my rankings, but I am curious to know what you guys think of my rankings or what you guys think of these movies in general. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel, but we will start right now. Episode 1. Episode 1 was great the first time I saw it. I was also 6 years old the first time I saw it. And then I hated it. And I've continued to hate it. And over the last couple years, it has slightly improved. But it's still really boring. I remember I had a girlfriend in high school who I was trying to watch the Star Wars films. She'd never seen them before. I wanted to get her kind of interested in the Star Wars films, and I made the mistake of starting canonically. And we were so bored halfway through Phantom Menace that we never watched any of the other movies. What this episode does great, I think it has great practical effects. I think it has, for the most part, decent acting from the two leads, those being Ewan McGregor and specifically Liam Neeson. I think all of the action scenes are very well put together. Nothing else really lands about this film. I do like the world building. I like the locations that they have returning to Tatooine. I like Naboo as a location in the franchise. I really like Coruscant. But the writing is really flat. The characters aren't very likable. There isn't a ton of that original trilogy charm that exists in this movie. Darth Maul was a really cool villain that was wasted by the end of the film. Conceptually, this movie is great, but in delivery, none of it really lands. Obviously, poor child acting. I'm not going to bash on Jake Lloyd too much because the internet has done that his entire life. Same with Ahmed Best in the role of Jar Jar Binks. But the humor in this episode, like I said, that charm that existed in the original trilogy, more specifically in the first 2 original trilogy films, just doesn't really exist in episode 1. But I do like all of the action sequences. I like the world building. That's kind of the only redeeming factors for this movie, in my opinion. I'm putting it firmly in D tier. Next, we move on to Attack of the Clones. Now, a lot of people really hate Attack of the Clones for a good reason. The CGI isn't quite where it needs to be to stay up to the level that all of the other films have, especially going forward. You look at Revenge of the Sith, which was released only 3 years later, and the graphic design, the computer-generated designs are immensely better for a 3-year gap. I'm going to do something a little controversial here. I'm going to put Attack of the Clones in C tier. Now, a lot of people really don't like Attack of the Clones because it doesn't really go anywhere. It's kind of this mystery movie that lacks a lot of momentum. And I don't criticize, I don't criticize that take more specifically. I think that's an accurate take. The acting between Natalie Portman and Hayden Christensen, the chemistry just isn't really there. The stuff between Anakin and Padme, rather, in both Episode 2 and Episode 3, and Episode 1, actually, isn't great. George Lucas has never been good at writing romantic scenes, specifically romantic dialogue. This film has a charm to me, being kind of one of those films from my childhood that I grew up watching a lot. I think the world design is spectacular, going off of what they built in the first episode. I like Camino. I like Geonosis. I think all of the The alien species that they add to this film are great. I think the politics plot behind the scenes is really underrated, actually, for me. All of the stuff leading to Palpatine's grab for power and his eventual takeover and transformation of the Galactic Republic into the Empire. I think they set the seeds really well in this film, a lot better than they do in the first film. I think the politics were really stripped back in this film. I think the editing of this film is really poor, especially in the early scenes. I think the scene of Padme's ship getting blown up at the beginning and how long it takes for the actors to react to that is a really poor editing decision. I like all of the chase scenes at the beginning of this film. The first third of this film is really fast-paced, really fun, and it kind of gets drawn on as the film goes. It doesn't really go anywhere by the end of it. And actually, I'm going to renege my decision. I think it is a D-tier movie, but I'm going to put it above Phantom Menace. I do really like Attack of the Clones. It has a charm for me that I really do enjoy. I'm putting it in D tier. Next, we move canonically on to Clone Wars. Now, Clone Wars came out in 2008. It was basically, if you're unfamiliar with the history of the Clone Wars TV show, there was a Clone Wars TV show between 2002 and 2005 that aired, was it on Cartoon Network? I can't remember what the original channel was, but it was 2D animation. It did really well in hyping up the Clone Wars. Canonically, it introduced us to General Grievous. It basically created this build up to episode 3 that you could argue they kind of fumbled in the delivery. You wouldn't really miss anything between episodes 2 and 3 if you didn't watch the original Clone Wars series, but in 2008 then they kind of revived that Clone Wars series. They didn't necessarily remove the canonicity of the original Clone Wars TV show, but they created this new one to add more to the franchise. They added the character of Ahsoka Tano, who doesn't appear in any of the original films. Obviously, we see her now with The Mandalorian and similar shows like that. But she was introduced in the Clone Wars movie. Now, the Clone Wars movie, I'm putting in F tier. The Clone Wars TV show is great. Don't get me wrong. Clone Wars TV show is probably the best TV show Star Wars has ever had. The Clone Wars film, which was a backdoor pilot that started the Clone Wars TV show, is not a good film. Essentially what this is 3 episodes of the Clone Wars TV show that they edited together to make a feature-length movie that they released in theaters to spark the Clone Wars TV show. It's not very good. It doesn't flow very well. The plot points don't really connect very well. The characters are nowhere near as good as they would turn out to be later on in the Clone Wars TV show. Much like episode 2, it just lacks any momentum. It just exists to exist. They wanted to get fans excited about the Clone Wars TV show, so they made this movie. It didn't do phenomenal at the box office. It still made money, but it's not a very good film. It does feel like 3 episodes of a TV show that they spliced together and put on screen. And so it's not a very good movie. It's not... The only thing I really enjoy about the film is it does Anakin's character justice, and I like the introduction of Ahsoka. All of the other characters are not very well realized on screen in this movie, in comparison to what some of them might be delivered upon later on in the TV show. So I'm putting it firmly in F tier. Feel free to debate me, but like I said, this is a ranking of Clone Wars, the film, rather than Clone Wars, the TV show, and it's going firmly in F tier. I did see it in theaters, and I liked it then. I was also 8 years old when it came out. So I'm putting it F tier upon my most recent rewatches there. Next, then we move on to Star Wars Episode 3, and here is my hot take of the day. I think Star Wars Episode 3 is an A-tier movie. I do. Dialogue aside, some of the dialogue choices, especially with the romance stuff, but more specifically when you move away from the romance, the stuff between Anakin and Obi-Wan, more specifically Anakin's dialogue toward the end of the film, is not very good. Hayden Christensen, I think, is very underrated in what he does with the material he's given. I just think he wasn't given very good material. That being said, everything else about this movie, I think, puts this film in A tier. I think the world design is at the peak that Star Wars ever delivered at. I think all of the different planets that they deliver on, the continuation of Coruscant, what we see with Tatooine at the end, we see Alderaan on screen at the end of this film. We see 3 or 4 different planets, Megiddo, Felucia, Cato Nemoidia, in the Jedi death scene. All of the stuff at the Jedi Temple is phenomenal. The CGI in this film is great. The opening shot of the battle over Coruscant, whether or not you agree with the Battle of Coruscant being a logistical fallacy, it doesn't really make sense as a battle. But when you put logic aside and suspend your disbelief for the sake of an action movie, the beginning of this film, the first 20 minutes of this film are the most fun I think I've ever had in Star Wars. And they continue on that greatly when they return to Coruscant. The movie slows down just a little bit, takes its time. Great world building with Utapau, great world building with Kashyyyk. Mustafar, the battle at the end, is my favorite lightsaber battle in all of Star Wars. The music is on point. It's no Duel of the Fates, but Anakin versus Obi-Wan, their battle scene, the music is almost on par with something like that. My favorite scene in this movie is one that I used to hate as a child. I thought it was boring. I thought it didn't make sense. I thought it was just a scene to be a scene. If you want to see Hayden Christensen act well, because obviously his acting has been criticized throughout the last 20 years in the Star Wars prequels. You want to see a scene where Hayden Christensen is able to work with the material he's given and do it incredibly well. Watch the Padme rumination scene, Anakin, the rumination scene. It's the scene where Anakin's at the Jedi Temple and he looks across Coruscant back at his home, and you see Padme looking across to the Jedi Temple, and they have kind of this silent communication where Anakin realizes what he has to do to accomplish the goals that are put ahead of him to save his wife. Hayden Christensen delivers. I think that is the most beautiful scene. I think the soundscape in that scene is phenomenal. One hidden gem, not hidden gem, it is his movie. Ian McDiarmid as Emperor Palpatine, or rather Chancellor Palpatine in this movie, is at his best. Now, you could argue some of the line delivery is really weird and very over the top. We're talking the do it line. We're talking the Force is strong with you scene after he's disfigured. He has so much fun with the material he's given. Obviously, everything in this movie has been memed to death, which takes away from the seriousness of the movie, but adds charm to the movie. The scene at the opera, the Darth Plagueis scene, I think is one of Ian McDiarmid's best scenes he's ever filmed in anything. Ewan McGregor is great in this film. All of the stuff. Hayden Christensen isn't given great material to work with in the battle scene with Obi-Wan at the end of the film, but Ewan McGregor delivers on everything he's given. Some of the writing is a little contrived. I have a lot of nostalgia for this film, and that might be why I'm putting it A tier, but dialogue aside, some of the writing contrivances aside, I think everything about this film works in a way the other prequels didn't. I'm putting it firmly bottom of A tier, in my opinion. Next, canonically, we move on to Solo. Solo is an interesting case because it's a film that didn't really need to happen. It doesn't really do anything for Han Solo's character. In fact, it kind of ruins the mystique a little bit. It's a fun movie. It's not really consequential. What I do like about this movie is I think Woody Harrelson gives a great performance. I think, here's my hot take. I think Donald Glover gives the best performance of Lando Calrissian that Lando Calrissian will ever have. I think he does it better than Billy D. Williams. That's my hot take of the day. I think it firmly sits C tier. It's not a great movie, but it's a passable movie. It's a fun romp. It's kind of one of those turn your brain off movies. It doesn't really do anything for me. It just exists. They greenlit this, and it kind of went through production hell. Obviously, we had two separate directors, I think, when the project started, and Ron Howard came in and kind of saved it, what it had, and you can kind of tell some of the, not the editing, but the momentum in this film, the tone of this film is kind of all over the place, especially as you get toward the end. Sometimes this movie can't decide if it's an emotional character piece or if it's a fun action romp. And that is very obvious, especially with the Kira scenes. But all in all, like, inconsequential. I think it sits firmly in C tier. I think it's a really average film. Next, we move on to Rogue One. This is probably... So when I saw this in theaters, I thought it was the best Star Wars film ever. I did. I genuinely did. And part of that might be because you leave the theater with the Darth Vader scene. And upon a rewatch, I understand the criticism that this film has. The beginning of this film is very slow. The first half or so of this film is really lacking what the last half of this film has. They cut a lot of scenes that were shown in the trailers of this film. They reworked this film, but I don't think it shows in the same way that Solo shows. I think Scarif, I think all of the planets in this movie are very well realized. I think the world building in this film is not quite as on par as something as like Revenge of the Sith, but I can't remember the name of they filmed it in Iceland. I've actually been to the filming location in Iceland where they filmed the opening farmer scene. I like Jeddah as a concept. I think Jeddah works as this desert planet in a way that Jakku doesn't. I responded better to Jeddah than I did with Jakku in the sequel films. And I really like Scarif. I think Scarif is one of the coolest set pieces in the Star Wars franchise. This film gets a lot of criticism for its character work, saying that the characters aren't really likable, aren't really well developed. I kind of disagree. I think Jyn Erso doesn't really have motivations at the start of this film, but she's compelled by her father's death and wishes by the end of this film. We kind of understand why she doesn't really have any feelings at the start of this film. I think the Bodhi the Defector, Cassian Andor, I think all of the Force-sensitive characters are actually pretty well developed on and built up toward their sacrifice at the end of this film. I think Orson Krennic is a great villain. You get this Grand Moff Tarkin wannabe, where he isn't at the level he wants to be leadership-wise, and so he kind of has this Napoleon complex, and Ben Mendelsohn delivers on that very, very well, I think. I want to put this film in A tier, but I think because of the fact that the first half of this film is really slow, I'm going to put it top of B tier. I really love Rogue One, but I think I'm going to put it in B tier. Next, then, we go straight into Star Wars, the original Star Wars film, Episode 4, A New Hope. I think this has to sit firmly in S tier. This film took kind of just the notion of a Kurosawa movie, or the feeling of a Kurosawa movie, put it in space, and delivered on it. There were not a lot of hopes with science fiction in the 70s. It was really campy. It was not well budgeted. And George Lucas came along and put his dream on screen, and it worked. This film was a phenomenon. It was a craze. It obviously sparked the nearly 50-year history. Yeah, we're at about 46 years this year of Star Wars. That has continued to this day, and obviously it's a billion-dollar franchise. You could argue that it's falling apart as a franchise, but we wouldn't have the franchise in its state like we would were it not for the original Star Wars film. I think all of the locations are very well realized on screen, especially for a low budget. I shouldn't say low budget. It still did have a pretty tremendous budget, but kind of an indie. What the project kind of started as this independent sci-fi film with not a lot going for it, and it was obviously picked up by 20th Century Fox, and they delivered on it very, very well. I really like this film. It's one of those films, as a contrarian, you kind of want to hate, but it is very good. It is a very good film. I think all of the characters are, if not likable, then you understand their motivations. You really feel for these characters. You understand why they're doing what they're doing. Darth Vader is a cool villain, but really the villain of this piece, the villain of the first Star Wars film, is Grand Moff Tarkin. And you don't, I never really realized that. Granted, I watched Star Wars religiously as a kid, and I never really understood that character beat until I was more mature and kind of understood that. Tarkin's the one pulling the strings. Vader is just kind of his puppet. And we really see Vader come into his own the rest of the series, but this sets up everything in motion for the rest of the trilogy. Next, then, let's move on to Empire Strikes Back. Everybody loves Empire Strikes Back. Everybody says it's the best film in the franchise. I want to be the contrarian and say that I don't think it's an S-tier film. I think it is an S-tier film. I do. It's very good. Me personally, this is a personal take. I get very bored by the middle of Empire Strikes Back. I think the space chase between Boba Fett and the Millennium Falcon crew is really slow and boring. And I think all of the stuff on Dagobah between Luke and Yoda is really boring. My personal opinion. I have argued that with all of my friends who are Star Wars fans. I've argued it online with people who are Star Wars fans. They disagree. They think that the movie was built that way on purpose. And so for this ranking specifically, I'm not going to let my own personal opinions diminish how much of a triumph Empire Strikes Back was. They took a gamble on making a sequel to the original Star Wars film. It didn't necessarily need a sequel, but it works, and it works really, really well. One other little criticism that I have, here's my hot take of the day. I think the CGI revised version of Empire Strikes Back is better than the original version, and for one sake only. And I had a buddy who thought this was the worst take he'd ever heard of any movie ever. I think that Bespin looks better with CGI windows. I think Bespin is too claustrophobic in the original cut of the film. I think Bespin is better realized as a film location, and I like it as a better film location with the CGI windows that they added. Was that in the 90s or the 2004 remake? I can't remember. Anyways, that being said, my personal hatred for the opening Hoth scene has nothing to do with the film and stems completely from my inability to finish the Hoth level on Lego Star Wars 2. Empire Strikes Back is a good movie. The character bits between Luke and Darth Vader are very good. Luke is continued upon as a great character from what he was in the original Star Wars film. I think Empire Strikes Back is an S-tier film. It's very good. It ends on a downbeat, but a slight bit of hope. It sets up the sixth film very well. It's an S-tier film. I can't, just for my own personal gripes, I can't quite put it as high as A New Hope, but it sits firmly in S-tier there. Then we go to Return of the Jedi, and here's my other hot take of the day. Return of the Jedi is not a good film. I'm going to put it bottom of B tier. I can't quite put it as low as C tier because I'll get ripped apart. I don't like Return of the Jedi. I like the first third of Return of the Jedi. I think all of the stuff on Tatooine is very good, but as soon as they rescue Han and go off to Dagobah and go off to the Death Star and go off to Endor, I think the movie falls apart. I really genuinely do. I think everything people criticized Phantom Menace for having in terms of its humor, in terms of its childishness, in terms of its poor writing, I think you can start to see some of that show up in Return of the Jedi. I like all of the stuff between Luke and Vader, but everything else about the last 2/3 of this film I think is delivered very poorly. I think it turns Obi-Wan into kind of an unlikable character. I think I think basically everything on Endor except the speeder chase is done really poorly. I think the writing is really inconsistent. I think sometimes it goes from almost horror-esque villainy and violence to over-the-top childish humor, and I don't think it meshes very well. I don't love the ship chase through the Death Star 2, but it wraps up the trilogy in a satisfying way. I don't feel dissatisfied by the end of Return of the Jedi. I just think the film in general is not a very good film. It doesn't drop the ball the way Rise of Skywalker does, excuse me, but it's not a great film, and it's really not great in comparison to the first two films. But I will still put it bottom of B tier. Feel free to argue with me in the comments section below. Next, we move on to Force Awakens. Force Awakens is a tricky one for me. A lot of people really like Force Awakens. And actually, so when I saw these three remaining films in theaters, the one I liked best when I left the theater was The Last Jedi. Now we'll get to The Last Jedi. I'm not going to say I like The Last Jedi, but upon my first watch of these films, when I left the theaters, I liked The Last Jedi the best. I thought Force Awakens was not a new take here, but I thought Force Awakens was definitely a rehash of A New Hope. I thought they built the characters pretty well. I really liked what they did in setting up both Rey and Finn. I think they are very likable characters in the first of these three films. Now, it's not the characters or the actors' fault that they dropped the ball on them going forward. Everything else about this film, though, feels really uninspired, in my opinion. I think it's a lot of nostalgia baiting. There are parts of this movie that don't feel like a Star Wars film to me. One that comes to mind is, I can't remember what the monsters are called. Basically, when they board the Millennium Falcon, and then the Millennium Falcon is boarded by Han and Chewie, and then again by whatever you want to call the characters who come, and then they release these alien monsters into the ship, whatever. To me, that doesn't feel Star Wars. That feels like a Guardians of the Galaxy scene. And that really took me out of my immersion as a Star Wars film. I like the stuff with Maz's Cantina. I don't like all of the vision stuff in the basement of Maz's castle. I don't love the end of this film. I don't love that they try to make it seem like a heist. I think the humor doesn't quite land the way they want it to. I think the stuff between Han and Kylo Ren is good, and Chewie's reaction is good. I don't like the fight at the end of this film. I don't really like the villain motivations in this film. I don't love Poe Dameron in this film. That being said, it did what it needed to do, and it wasn't a bad film. I think I can put it bottom of B tier. I think it deserves to go above Solo. I personally don't think it's as good as Rogue One or Return of the Jedi. I am putting Force Awakens bottom of B tier. Let's talk then about The Last Jedi. Like I said, when I left the theaters the first time I watched The Last Jedi, I really liked it. I did. I am a fan of Rian Johnson's films. What I didn't foresee, so this is the contrarian in me coming out, right? I liked the subversion of I liked him subverting my expectations upon my first watch of the film. I did. Then I thought about it, and I rewatched it, and now almost 5 years have passed. When did that movie come out? Almost 6 years have passed, actually. And I realized Almost all of the problems that exist in the Star Wars franchise right now can be traced back to The Last Jedi. Just a disregard for the future, a disregard for the past. I liked the Canto Bight scenes as a world building device. Let's go through this film real quick so I can kind of voice my opinions in a more cohesive way. So the film starts, obviously they're in space. There's all the stuff with the bomber bay at the beginning of the film, and Poe basically sacrificing a whole bunch of the fleet to make an attack on the First Order. I think Poe is a more likable character in this film than he was in the previous film. I think he definitely steps up as a more, I shouldn't say, he's more in the forefront. He's more in the front cast of this film. Oscar Isaacs really came into his own as a pop culture, I shouldn't say icon, but a pop culture A to top of B-list celebrity between episodes 7 and 8. And so they really used him in this film well. All of the stuff that happens with Leia and Admiral Holdo in this film, I don't think it does them justice. I think those characters are written to be very unlikable. They are written in a way that makes you want to hate them for no other reason than the writing tells you to hate them. It's effective, but upon rewatch, there's no reason for them to act the way they do. And it just causes tension for the sake of causing tension, and it doesn't really mean anything in a grand scope. And so I think that goes against this film. Then we have all the stuff on Canto Bight. Now, I love Canto Bight as a location. I think it's very well realized. I think it's a very fun location. I really like this idea of Star Wars Casino. I do really genuinely like that. I think it's very well realized. Obviously, Rose is not a very likable character, especially by the end of the film. The character motivations there are a little bit preachy. It's we don't care about child slaves, but let's free all of the locked up animals kind of thing. It's a very one note, doesn't really go anywhere, not really realized on a greater scale kind of character piece. Finn takes a back seat despite that being his side story. I don't love that. All of the stuff with DJ, that's Benicio del Toro's character, it doesn't go anywhere. All of the stuff with Captain Phasma, that doesn't go anywhere. And so this film, despite all of the subversion of expectation things, I think what people really don't like about this film, and what I have grown to really dislike about this film, is it writes things to write things, and nothing goes anywhere. By the end of this film, nothing really happens, if that makes any sense. Like, this film, they write scenes because they want scenes to happen. They don't write things to happen to create these scenes, if that makes any sense. And so by the end of this film, you get a whole bunch of cool set pieces. I really love the world design in The Last Jedi. I think this is one of the best looking Star Wars films. But nothing happens. We get all this stuff with Luke that basically rewrites the end of his character. And I don't necessarily hate that in a conceptual level. I think that you could have this idea of Luke being a lost Jedi character. Last Jedi, yeah, sorry, pun not intended. I think you could have Luke where he is in this film emotionally and spiritually, but I don't think the writing supports it. So when you get someone like Mark Hamill even arguing that, like, this isn't the Luke that he left in episode 6, I don't disagree with that, but I also, like, characters can evolve off screen if the writing is good enough to support it. And I don't think the writing in this film is good enough to support it. We get the subversion of expectations, but I don't think that it's written in a way that supports the subversion of these expectations. I don't think that the whole drama backstory between Luke and Kylo Ren is written in a way that supports Luke's character change. All of the stuff with Snoke, I think Snoke was built up to be this very cool character in episode 7, and when we get him in episode 8, they take the mystique away from him, and they kill him. Now, they kill him in a really, really cool scene. But they didn't, they did it to do it. It didn't have to happen. The stuff with Admiral Holdo, when she does the Holdo maneuver, I was like, that was the coolest scene I'd ever seen in Star Wars when I watched it the first time. I was like, oh, this is awesome. Nothing came out of it. It didn't, the characters aren't moved by it. It buys the team time, and nobody ever talks about it ever again. And so, kind of the theme of this film, and why I liked the film so much upon my first watch, is this is very much a spectacle film. It's filled with moments that make you go, holy crap, that was cool, that was awesome. I can't believe they did that. But the writing doesn't support the background to any of these scenes or the repercussions from any of these scenes. And I think that's why people hate this film so much. And I don't disagree with that, especially upon rewatching this so many times. I still, I'll put it D tier. I'm going to put Last Jedi between episodes 1 and 2. Just because I think it's a very good-looking film. I think it's a very cool film. I think all of the ideas were there. It was really cool. And it just didn't go anywhere. And nothing happens. Best-looking Star Wars film. Most fun experience I've had as a fan of Star Wars in the theaters. But it doesn't go anywhere. And I hate it upon rewatching it. And then we get to the last film, The Rise of Skywalker. F tier, bottom of F tier, worst Star Wars film ever. The franchise is dead. Goodbye. End of video. This is at least 2 Star Wars films, maybe 3 Star Wars films in one. It's way too long. The tone is all over the place. The editing is poor. The pace of this film is non-existent. My father fell asleep 2 different times during this film. This film sucks. They brought back Palpatine because they needed a villain. Because Last Jedi killed off the villain. This film was made to fix the problems with The Last Jedi, and it didn't even deliver on fixing things. All of the characters are unlikable. The only, I think, redeeming character in this film is Kylo Ren. I think Adam Driver leaves everything he has on the table in this film. Oscar Isaacs as Poe Dameron is dislikable. They fly now, by the way. I think John Boyega is given nothing. Finn is a non-existent character, and we all know why they did it. It's because the Chinese are racist, but the Chinese have a lot of money, and so they built Finn up as this really cool character in the first film of this trilogy, and the Chinese didn't want a black guy on the screen, but China was giving Star Wars a lot of money, and so they took the black guy out of the main. That's why they took Finn out. We know that. Rey's character motivations disappear. We don't understand her motivations in this film. It's like a whole bunch has happened off screen that we never get to see. It's touched upon, but it's not delivered upon. Obviously, they couldn't really use Leia in this film because Carrie Fisher had passed away before. I think she passed away before Last Jedi was released. If I'm not mistaken, she died right after Rogue One came out. But anyway, so they used found footage for her. Not found footage. They used archive footage for her in this movie, and it's not done very tastefully. It's not done very well. None of the locations are that memorable. The set design in this film is probably the worst of this trilogy. The action scenes are not well delivered upon. The final battle is really poor. It's just big space laser in space. It feels like I'm watching a Marvel movie, but I want to be watching Star Wars. I think, genuinely, I think that's part of the problem I have with The Last Jedi, Last Jedi too, but this trilogy in general, specifically starting with Force Awakens, it feels like Star Wars is trying to make Star Wars feel like a Marvel movie. And I don't want that. I want Star Wars to feel like a good Star Wars film. And this is that turned up to 11. It's a bad film. I don't want to spend 20 minutes talking about why The Rise of Skywalker is a bad film. If you want a good analysis of Rise of Skywalker as a bad film, go check out JX's channel. They have a great video on, I think it's almost like 3 hours long, but it talks about why The Rise of Skywalker is such a poor film. That's on JX's channel, so go check that out. But it's bad. It was a worse theater experience and continues to be a worse. I've rewatched this film twice since I saw it in theaters. It's a worse watching experience than Clone Wars, and Clone Wars is also a film that is 3 separate things put together. It sucks. Franchise is dead. Mandalorian sucks now. Here's where we sit. Of these 12 films, Star Wars theatrically released films. Bottom of F tier. Number 12, Rise of Skywalker. Number 11, Clone Wars. Number 10, we move up to D tier. Episode 1, Phantom Menace. Number 9, Episode 8, The Last Jedi. Number 8 is Attack of the Clones. Moving up to C tier. Number 7, Solo. Number 6, The Force Awakens. Number 5, Return of the Jedi. Number 4, Rogue One. Number 3, Revenge of the Sith. Number 2, Empire Strikes Back. And number 1 for me in S tier is going to be the original Star Wars film, A New Hope, Episode 4. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. Feel free to argue. Feel free to give me as many angry opinions as you want to. Honestly, the more attraction that this video gets, the better for the channel. So I really don't care how negative you get down there. It would be nice to see that some of my opinions are okay, though. But like, share, and subscribe to the channel. There's more Star Wars content in the link on the bottom right hand of your screen as this video comes to a close. Come back here on Monday for our Star Wars live stream. But in the meantime, we'll see you very, very soon.